Hi, this is Sarah, and to follow is a short video on the traits and factors that contribute to addiction. So, there are four key factors that contribute to alcohol use disorder. There is a part played by our genetics, there is an influence from a psychological perspective, a social perspective, and also from a spiritual point of view. In terms of our genes, there is no one gene that's responsible for alcohol use disorder. There is definitely a significant amount of research showing that family history increases our risk of developing alcohol use disorder, and that is down to heritable sensitivity and environmental factors. The risk genes that we may have inherited from our parents are activated by the environment. So things like early stress, trauma, and early exposure to alcohol definitely increase our risk of falling into alcohol use disorder. The sensitivity from a genetic perspective comes in many different forms, but primarily it's sensitivity to certain substances based on lower levels of neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, and also increased hormone levels in terms of adrenaline and cortisol. So when we are born into a highly stressful environment, we are more likely to have a high stress response, as in a low stress tolerance. And we may also have those risk genes that, if they are activated by increased and ongoing stress and trauma, and then, of course, being activated by a substance like alcohol, we are much more likely to fall into addictive patterns. From a psychological perspective, early childhood trauma, and the reason there are two there is that the capital T trauma is significant things like abuse, neglect, divorce, death, sexual abuse. Those types of things fall under the capital T trauma. And then little t trauma is things like abandonment, lack of nurturing, lack of being taken care of at the level at which we are meant to be taken care of. So it's not so much the addition of bad things, but it's actually us not receiving what we're meant to be receiving as children. That increases our stress hormone levels and our susceptibility to addiction. And we also inherit from our parents things like negative thought patterns, not being able to self-regulate. If we observe our parents being unable to self-regulate, calm their own nervous system, then we also don't learn how to do that. So there are lots of behaviors that are modeled in childhood that we inherit as well. From a social perspective, you will see, as I'm sure you're aware, a huge amount of marketing and promotion of alcohol in society. The media constantly talks about the benefits of red wine, things like that we read on a regular basis. And alcohol is, of course, very socially acceptable. And in fact, even now, there are times when if somebody doesn't drink, it's seen as them that has the problem. We have our peer groups, so the people that we surround ourselves with will have a huge influence on how we feel about our drinking habits. There's the stigma, the fear of being labeled as an alcoholic, and the natural human desire to conform and to be part of the tribe. So we are very, very influenced by society and by our environment in which we live. And then we have the spiritual side. Many of us in today's world do not have a connection with ourselves. Many of us are isolated and have limited connection with other people. We have this sense that we are alone and isolated, that we are somehow different from other people. Very less and less people have a sense of faith, believing in something greater than themselves. And people often talk about having no sense of meaning or purpose in their lives. And all of these four things contribute to us looking for something outside of ourselves to soothe our discomfort. And obviously, alcohol being the go-to for many people in order to relieve physical and mental pain. So all of these systems are finely tuned by our environment. If we have the alcohol risk genes, we are not doomed to fall into addictive patterns, but it is more likely. Similarly, with a psychological high stress levels and negative thought patterns clearly contributing to us looking for something to take away any mental and emotional pain, social environment, and a lack of spiritual connection. The traits that underlie addictive behaviors include the inability to self-regulate. This means we have difficulties self-soothing and calming. We have impaired impulse control. We're very reactive. Lack of differentiation, meaning that we get caught up in other people's emotions and dramas. A lack of a healthy sense of self, leading to low self-esteem and self-worth. And sometimes a sense of a void, some kind of emptiness inside and lack of purpose and meaning. There are three dominant brain systems that are hijacked when we become addicted: the opioid system, the dopamine system, and the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in self-regulation. That is in the ability to go within to calm ourselves down instead of looking for something external to do that for us. And these systems can be sabotaged in early life, as I mentioned. This leads to overactive unconscious systems that are driven by the primitive brain, the one that we have very little control over, and an underdeveloped control system. This is the prefrontal cortex and our ability or inability to self-regulate. The brain responds by rewiring with repeated alcohol use. The parts of the brain that are rewired are the ones for self-regulation, reward, learning, and memory. The brain systems that are fundamentally designed to keep us alive actually become hijacked. And the excessive reward that we experience when we drink alcohol ends up trumping any natural feeling of reward. So the brain learns to prefer alcohol and places it at the top of our needs. This is why we can often be driven almost unconsciously towards drinking, as opposed to being able to sit back and decide what might be a healthier way to soothe our discomfort. Here are some signs that you may be at risk of alcohol use disorder: increase in alertness and elevated mood when you drink. Specifically, people with a predisposition to alcoholism tend to feel very good and energized for long periods of time when they're drinking. Inability to control impulses, meaning you can often feel like you're on autopilot with limited control over your decision to drink or keep drinking. High tolerance, you can drink more and more and more without feeling the effects, and you have to increase the amount or the strength of the drinks that you're consuming. Blackouts, so this is when we experience memory loss, but we're still essentially awake and doing things and saying things that we regret. And sometimes even taking risks like driving, doing things that you wouldn't normally do if you were thinking clearly, and then not remembering them. And obviously stress and anxiety. You experience more anxiety and stress than you did before you were a regular drinker. Continued alcohol use does actually increase our baseline levels of stress over time. So that's a brief overview of the factors and traits of addiction. And these are important things to know because ultimately they reduce a lot of shame associated with us becoming ensnared in the alcohol trap. Many of the things that I've described are beyond our control, But the good news is we can change the brain with neuroplasticity, and we can take responsibility for our own unique situation and make the changes that we need to make so that we can move past alcohol and onto an enjoyable alcohol-free life.